Welcome back to Adventure Repeats. Glad to see you here. So what we're going to do today is we're going to show you how to do an alignment at home on one of these brand new 2024 Chevrolet 2500HDs. So if this is your first time here, make sure you like the video, comment, tell us what you think, tell us what you want to hear about, and subscribe. We got a lot of great content coming, a lot of great content on the channel, so be sure to check it out. So how are we going to do this today? Well, sometimes if you don't want to have time to get to the dealership, sometimes the dealership doesn't do a good job like they did for me. You can do these at home yourself. It's actually pretty simple with a few basic tools you might actually have around the house. So I like to use a bubble level. That gives me verification on everything. You can use an angle finder, not necessary, but it does help for numbers and dimensions like that. A tape measure is a good way to double check everything. Some yard string, any kind of string works, and I'll show you how that goes with it. And just a couple wrenches. Doesn't take much to do this job. It's pretty simple and straightforward, so we'll show you how it's done. To start off with, I always try to park my truck on a level surface as best I can. Mostly the left and right surface is what matters to make sure the suspension is even and stable. But what I always do is, because you always have to drive the truck back and forth to make sure your adjustments all settle in just properly, I always take some chalk and mark it. I mark where the front of the tire is and the side of the tire is on all four tires. Doing so means I can always put the truck back in the exact same place I started, because sometimes you get variations in the driveway and the concrete and wherever you park. So to have repeatable results, you want to be parked in the same position. So that's one thing I always do to make sure I get started and have repeatable results in the long term. So that's where we start. Now with doing alignment, you have three different adjustments that you have to take into consideration. So first is you have your caster, which is how much the knuckle tips towards the back of the vehicle. You have camber, which is how much this tire tips in or out on the vehicle, and then toe, how much the front of the tire points in or out on the vehicle itself. I always like to start and make sure my caster is in first, or where I want it to be, because that is the one that affects the biggest adjustments on this vehicle. So if you have a brand new vehicle from the factory, it's going to probably be on the money. So if you just crank up the torsion bars like I did, you should never have to adjust this angle. It should be already on the money for you. There's nothing you really have to do about that. But if you're starting fresh on a vehicle that everything got torn apart on, there's a couple ways you can go about it. There's really not good ways to measure it. You can measure it from the front of the knuckle, where there's a surface on them, and when they're cast relatively about the same, so you can ideally just match them side to side, because really you just want both sides to match. The angle itself isn't as big of a deal as just being even with each other, because if one side has more tip to the back than the other side, it's going to pull to that side. And having angle back is what allows the steering wheel to go back to center on its own and stay there. So this was set from the factory, so I didn't have to adjust it. But if you wanted to adjust it and play with it yourself, you have these adjustment bolts up top here. So you got your front side right there, and then your back side. You have that little pin that's in there. That's where you got those marks on there. That's all that is. And you've got it on both sides. So if you really want to play with it, the way they design these is everything's built to tolerance of machines. So ideally, if you just make sure these numbers are both the same on each side, front and back, and left side and right side, it will more than likely be on the money and even. So that's up to you where you start from there. So this was actually everything was the same, so I didn't have to adjust any of it, and it's good to go, and they're even from left side to right side. The next thing is you check camber. I'll show you how to do that now. Now there's two different ways camber can be adjusted, and this is the dimension for how much this tire is tipping in or out on the vehicle. Ideally, you want this to be straight up and vertical, or as close as possible you can get to there. So you can do this with a straight edge and an angle finder, or just simply using a standard bubble level. So the idea is you can go across the tire, right across the face. Obviously this one doesn't reach the outside of it, so I'm just going to go right to the edge as far as I can on this tire and check to make sure that bubble level is in. You can always use your angle finder on there as well to check to make sure it is on the money as for that process as well. So it's a good, easy, just double check on the system. You do this on both sides. If that adjustment is out and they do need to be tipped, you will do with that upper camber and caster bolts. So you have the two bolts inside and outside. you just want to make sure you move both of them the same, in or out, because if you just do one, you're then going to tip the knuckle and affect your caster. So you always want to make sure you do both bolts at the same time. It's simply one nut comes off the one side, and the other one that has a hex on there, that's what adjusts the actual bolt itself. So when you're trying to loosen it up, you just do the nut side only. The other side is where you actually turn it to turn the bolt and adjust it itself. So obviously I've already checked on these. Both sides are already good. So the next thing to move on to is now toe in and out of the tires themselves. Now, for adjusting toe on the tires, you obviously want the tires to be either straight and lying forward and back, so they're both parallel with each other, or slightly tipped inwards. That is per spec, because if they are both tipped outwards, that'll cause the vehicle to kind of wander around a lot. Even though you hold the steering wheel straight, it'll just kind of wander. So you either want them to be perfectly straight, parallel with each other, or you want just a slight tip in, and that's where most vehicles are, and that is where it is actually the most comfortable to drive and the steering is most secure and stable. So I just like to take my yard string and just tie it to a tow hook. You can also use just the old-fashioned tape measure across the treads, which we do to actually double check and verify our measurements, but the string is how I like to start with, because that is going to give me the best equal dimensions on both sides, because I'm going to check it and I'll show you why. So now what I'm doing is when I stretch the string out all the way, what I want to do is stop the string when it just touches the back side of that tire. Just like that. So I'll go out where it's loose, and when it stops moving, it'll stop right there. And then I come check it at the back tire itself and just check what the gap is. So on this truck, for my alignment to be in spec, if you run the string across, it is about 1/4 inch away from the tire on both sides, and that will give me a slight toe in. So that's all I'm doing, is just doing it on both sides. The reason I do this more than a tape measure is because a tape measure on the inside and outside of the tire, on front and back, that's over 3 feet maybe of distance. Now this, I'm checking this dimension over 16 feet. So the further the distance you go, the more accurate your results can be to make sure you're tuned in properly for your tires. So an up close view of what you're looking for is when it's wrapped across the front and you go to here, you are just waiting for that string to just touch the tire. As you can see where the actual string starts to bend, that's how you know you're touching. So when you see it stop and stop there, that's how you check it on the back side to make sure you're in the proper location. If you ever need to adjust the toe on these trucks, it is done by the front end right here. You have this jam nut that you have to loosen up, and then right here you got some flats. That's how you turn this bar. You're just threading this in or out of the outer tie rod end. So that's all it is. So if you loosen that jam nut, you either thread it in or thread it out, and that's how you adjust it. So obviously if you're going counterclockwise, you are unthreading it. That is pushing the front end of the tire out. And if you're going clockwise towards the front, that is threading it in, which is then pulling the outer of the tire back in and towing in the vehicle. It is the same for the other side of the truck. So that's all it takes. Do the alignment yourself at home in your driveway. Some basic simple tools, and it's easy to do. So the key note to doing this yourself is every time you make an adjustment, you're going to want to drive the truck to the end of the driveway and back, just to go back and forth to let the suspension resettle. Because when you're especially doing your cast or camber, even pulling the toe in or out on the tires themselves, it'll pull the rubber of the tires and pull the wheel, but everything will be kind of stretched out of shape. So you want to drive it down and drive it back and make sure the steering wheel gets recentered again, and then recheck your dimensions, because obviously the idea is you always want your steering wheel to be centered. So sometimes when you're moving your toe, it'll pull that lock in the steering wheel off just a hair. So you always want to drive it down and drive it back to make sure the suspension resettles, gets recentered, and then recheck your dimensions. So this does take a little bit more time than if you went to a shop and had it done, where they have a machine that has ball bearing plates that everything moves and slides and glides on very nice and easy. But if you don't want to pay the prices to get it done, this is how to do it at home the easy way, with just a couple hours of your time and a few basic hand tools. That's all there is to it. So hopefully this video is helpful and you like the video. Comment, tell us what you think, tell us what you want to hear about, and subscribe. We got a lot of great content coming, a lot of great content already on the channel, so be sure to check it out, and remember to have a great adventure.